Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I know there's a lot of time zones represented in the room. So where we are, Eastern Standard Time is just afternoon. Welcome to Project 180. This is where we turn your project around. It's a web series where we interview professionals in the PM space and all sorts of different industries to talk about best practices and things we've learned along the way. Today, hi, Deanna.
Hi, Kevin.
We have a very special guest. This is Deanna Davies, and we'll be chatting about emotional intelligence and the human side of project management. So Deanna, please, can you introduce yourself for those who maybe don't know you already?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. It's a beautiful day here in Kingston. My name is Deanna Davies, and I am a program coordinator for the Project Management Graduate Certificate Program at St. Lawrence College for Kingston and Cornwall. I'm also a professor in the program as well. And I also have 27 years of professional experience behind me before I came to academia. And in that world, I had my own consulting company. I also worked for corporate, for government, and I had the opportunity to really dive into a variety of different projects, predominantly on the business side, strategy side, and marketing. Bringing that all together, and now at the end of my career, and I say the end because who knows what's going to be happening in the future, I've been able to bring those experiences into the classroom to really learn from our future leaders. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm based in Kingston, Ontario.
Well, great. Thanks, Deanna. And it's great to meet you. Well, we've met before. Great to have you here. And I really appreciate you taking the time to chat today.
Thank you.
We want to talk about the human side of things, right? Because, and I've been percolating on this, well, for weeks now, really, since we talked about it. But one of the things that occurs to me is that we as, project managers or whatever our titles might be, it's really easy to get locked in. Oh, the next sprint's starting. We got to make sure, the Gantt chart's falling behind. We get in all these little modes of chaos management, right? Trying to figure out what happens next in the next project. And it's really easy to forget that they're human beings that you're dealing with, not just Microsoft Project or Smartsheet or Excel or whatever it is you're managing your stuff in. So as a project manager, as a leader, I'm curious, what do you see in terms of the value really of emotional intelligence, but also just realizing that these are people you're dealing with, not just projects and budgets?
Absolutely, Kevin. And we know that AI is here. AI is here to stay. I love to call her, him, or they, depends on my day. Her name is Charlie. So she's there to help me whenever I possibly can. And we've got all kinds of different resources around us. The one resource that is also ever changing is the human being. And we can't do projects without them. And this has been since the early days. And it's still here to stay. And, we keep reading all these things. Well, the jobs will be gone. No, the jobs aren't going to be gone. They're just going to evolve into different types of roles. And when we deal with human beings, we're dealing with creatures of emotions. We're all human beings. Even as we lead teams, we often forget about ourselves. And so you ask me, where does emotional intelligence fall into this? Emotional intelligence is the ability to manage our own emotions, recognize our own emotions, but also recognize the emotions of others and appreciate and understand, to the best of our ability, the emotions of others. And so when we are leading teams, or even when we are on teams, are we using emotional intelligence to continue to thrive on that human side of projects? Because it has to happen. Our projects, we all know from beginning to end, is a momentum forward. And we have to know that we can't leave the humans behind. So I think, does that answer your question? Why is it so important? It's because we're all creatures of emotions.
Yeah.
And the people absolutely matter in our projects.
Well, I reflect back. I've been in the game. I've been working, corporate gigs for 30 years now. This is 30 years this spring. Oh my God. Where's the time go? But
We're
I
becoming
reflect slowly but surely. I reflect back on, the bosses, the managers, the VPs, the directors, and the leaders I've had over the years. And at this point in my life, and I would argue I'm a fairly emotionally intelligent person. I'm aware generally of my own and that of others. Not perfect, but I try. But I reflect back, and any of the leaders that I've had, if they had that high EQ, I tend to remember them very positively. And if they didn't, and it was much more of like, get it done, then less so. Right. And sometimes I find in the moment, you don't necessarily, because you're working on a thing and you got to get the thing done and then you get paid and everything's good. But the side of it that lasts, has a more of a lasting impact with you personally, is that connection and that humanity. So how do you, like in your own experience, how have you kind of balanced out, the better maybe EQ bosses and the less good, I guess, EQ bosses over the year?
Yeah. Well, and I love, Kevin, that you mentioned that, the bosses or leaders that we all remember, often immediately you can see this moment that you have internally, right? You can feel the emotions, the endorphins, because they bring up fond memories. And often those are memories of respect, trust, and a relationship. And so with leaders that are using emotional intelligence, the first thing that we have to think about is you have to know yourself. We have to know ourselves. And how often, and I'm sure all the PMs on this call, have you been given a project and go, there you go, go. Who's on your team? Don't know. You're going to have to figure them out. And so often, right, we'll grab it and we start running. And so techniques that we could have, and it's easier said than done because this takes conscious effort, is to actually pause, check in with ourselves. There's the 4 components of emotional intelligence. So just think about this as the leader yourself before we talk about others. The leaders that have shown us strong EQ have the self-awareness, the self-management, the social awareness, and the relationship management components. They know that when they spend that time on those 4 areas for themselves, they can then foster that in others. And so, key things that we need to do from the beginning, and again, easier said than done, but if we consciously do it, it does work, is taking that pause of reflection of ourselves. Do you know, and I think about this all the time, we're all evolving, right? Emotional intelligence isn't just about taking one course or reading one book and saying, done. It's about evolving and it's about growing. And so we change. I'm not the same person I was yesterday. And so every day doing that check-in with, hey, how am I feeling right now? Where are my points, my trigger points? Where's my stress level? And if we can check in with ourselves, it helps us to be able to manage others as well.
I really appreciate how you explained that. The self-awareness piece being, I mean, it's generally obvious to find when people are not maybe self-aware, but you're not necessarily aware that you're not self-aware, right? So how as a leader, or even just as a person, but really as a leader, you're working in the team and you're trying to get a project done, you're trying to accomplish things.
Yeah.
How does that enter that inner dialogue, that inner conversation? How do you get to a point where you're just like, okay, maybe I'm not as aware? Like, how do you have that light bulb moment?
I think it's practice. Kevin, and again, I'm going to go back, it's intention. You know, as leaders in project management, we are continually under stress. You know, sometimes when I teach leadership at the post-secondary level, and sometimes I'll put an image of the cat in the hat. Is everyone familiar with the cat in the hat? And he's balancing on that ball, and he really enjoys that he's getting onto one leg, and then he starts balancing a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. We're all cat in the hats as project managers. However, how much we end up balancing and how long we end up balancing is self-awareness. So if we can do that check-in, we then know, where are my trigger points? Where is my capacity? What is my body telling me? Because our bodies will often whisper, right? Mm-hmm. They go, psst, I've had enough. I've had enough. Until finally we drop everything. We go, oh my gosh, that came from nowhere. Well, it's just that we weren't actually listening. And so, you know, for leaders, I think we just need to practice it. That self-awareness piece is important. Check in with ourselves. Mm-hmm. So often, depending on your leadership style, and we all have different styles, but so often we're doing for others that we're not checking in with ourselves. And it's kind of that old theory, right? You know, we've heard of the oxygen mask. Mm-hmm. You know, if we're not doing that for ourselves as leading projects, our teams are watching us. Our teams need us to foster trust. They need us to foster and emulate the team atmosphere, the collaboration. Mm-hmm. We need to create psychological safety. How do we do that if we don't have that ourselves? And again, it's easier said than done sometimes, but it takes that conscious effort, and it's so worth it.
Yeah, I think like so many points, but the idea of, you know, it's not, you can't read the book and all of a sudden, bam, you've got it. It is something you have to put effort into and remind yourself, because to your cat in the hat point, if you don't, you're going to be the one balancing 500 things, and then you're balancing nothing because you're burnt and you can't do anything anymore, and you need that, you know, career break, or, you know, whatever might happen. I've been there. I'm sure others on the call have been there in some, you know, manner of speaking. So it's really about leadership is, you know, leadership's great, but if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of the team. That goes with any relationship, right? You can't take care of others unless you're taking care of yourself first.
For sure, for sure. You know, Kevin, I had the privilege of doing a workshop at PM Evolve and PM Rise this past fall. And we talked a little bit about this topic. And I also teach yoga as well. And so one of the things that I've shared with my classroom is, how do you find breath? Because when we think about our stress levels, they're all at different ranges. We lose our breath. And so what happens if we actually take that pause and we find the breath? Because the breath is found between the calm and the chaos. And when that breath is found as a leader, we see clearer. Think about when we're all under that cat in the hat moment of stress. We're reacting. We are pushing things out. And so when we can take that breath, and it's okay, a strong, emotional, intelligent leader will tell their teams, I need to take that breath. I need to take a moment. Whether you use those terms or not, you figure out your style.
Yeah.
But when we can do that, we can be transparent with the teams. And when there's transparency, we then start to see stronger dialogue happening. We can deal with conflict a little bit better. We are seeing more because we're being able to be more visual, because we found the calmness within us.
I'm going to pause for a second take a breath, right? To remind folks that if you have comments, questions, please in the chat or feel free to click the raise hand button and join in the conversation. I don't mean to take over the whole thing, but we will unless you chime in. Transparency. This is something I've been percolating a lot on too, because you're right. I mean, obviously you're right, but I in terms of having a transparent style and transparent communication, that really leads to a very scary word for a lot of people, though, which is vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And when you are really vulnerable and you're the leader and you're not supposed to be vulnerable, right? Like there's this clash, I think, in my head, certainly over the years, like, okay, I have to lead and I have to be there for them, but I can't be vulnerable to them, which means a certain amount of I have to hold a lot back. I can't be transparent. I can't be 100% transparent. Right. I've unlearned that lesson myself personally, because I think the best way to harbor or create any kind of relationship in a work situation or even outside of work is you have to be, open, honest, and bold. You're not telling everybody everything about your life, maybe necessarily, right? Yeah. But you find a comfortable space where you can be vulnerable and say, this is stressing me out too. I've been losing sleep over this over the last couple of days. I need your help on this.
And that's it, Kevin. It's finding that balance. I love that you said that. If you can tell your team and have that confidence, you've built that trust and that transparency to say, you know what, hey guys, I'm actually struggling with this too. But now you've got to find that fine balance of your professionalism as well. But, without wanting to always quote different books, but if you've read like Brene Brown, Dare to Lead, talking about leading with vulnerability. And how do we do that? We're human. We are absolutely human. And so finding that balance in showing the vulnerability, but also coming back with potential solutions and or leaning into your teams, allowing them to be part of the solutions as well. That's when you're building that mutual trust, which then touches back on your relationships with your teams. Don't we all want at the end to be able to build those strong relationships that when the next gig comes or the next project comes, because we know it's probably coming, do we not want to be able to go to our Rolodex? Yeah, I'm showing my age. Or we go to our LinkedIn, or we go to whoever. And
thank you for saying Rolodex.
That's it. You notice I did this, my Rolodex. But I want to go back and be able to say, hey, Kevin and I, or Pete and I worked on that project. We got along really well. We also saw solved problems. We found efficiencies. Maybe we'll bring them on to this project. So it's about looking into the future too. So somebody with a strong emotional intelligence or that having that awareness is able to build that, leaning into that vulnerability, but finding the balance.
Mm-hmm. I think in terms of leadership, I mean, there's so many books and lines and quotes you can use, but leadership really shouldn't be singular, right? It really is something that takes the whole team. Regardless of size, if you're working on a project X with 20 people, you are engaging with those 20 people and you need to have relationships with those 20 people, and you need to understand who they are, what their good qualities are, maybe they're not so good quality. You need to be able to work through all that stuff. And that just goes to show that having that higher EQ is really going to bolster that team and make everybody feel better working there. Because the worst thing you can have is having that leader coming down and just yelling and screaming all the time. Nobody likes that. Yeah. No one. And they're looking for the exit. And you want somebody who, hey, maybe they leave at some point, but you don't want you to be the reason that they go.
Yeah. And I'd love to ask anyone on this call, how many of us love to be yelled at?
Pete does.
Right? And so, there was a time and a day and an age, and of course, industries have different styles of leadership. And it doesn't mean that we all need to be holding hands and singing a song around a fire. But what it does mean is that if we have that awareness of emotional intelligence, we can lead with kindness. And one of the things I like to say is, you know what? I can be fair, but I can also be firm. And my delivery of the firmness is often taken at a different context. Should I lose my cool and yell and raise my voice? And so I think that that is really important as we look to remembering that we need to have that fine balance. And you can still have the same respect by using emotional intelligence in your leadership style with projects.
Let me ask you this, pivoting a little.
Yeah.
Your hypothetical situation, you're leading a new team. You've been assigned this new thing and you've got to hire 10 people or whatever to bring and get this thing going, whatever it might be. In your HR side of things, when you're looking to fill those positions, how would you navigate, the interview process and make sure that, you weren't just looking for somebody who knew project really well. You're not just looking for somebody who's really great at organizing scrum calls. You're looking for somebody who has that high EQ. How would you help, or how would you use that in your search?
I think what I would do, and you said that you're in an interview, right? So key things that I would be doing is I would add situational questions. And so by adding those situational questions, you can listen for key words, little tiny words such as we versus I,
Mm-hmm.
we versus I. But I feel I would. So I would add in situational questions to really just evaluate. Now, of course, there are some organizations that actually in their interview processes have brought back, we're seeing this new comeback. I've taught temperament theory also for the past 25 years and personality styles. So we're seeing people bringing these back, Workplace Big Five, True Colors, Personality Dimensions, MBTI, and then also emotional intelligence and asking them actually to do quizzes. I am not an HR expert. Maybe we do have one on the line, but certainly that is a trend that we're starting to see come back. But you can easily ask situational questions that can actually foster some of those responses.
Sorry, Deanna, I was just seeing a couple of texts pop up on the screen, so I was wondering if anybody had any questions. Mark had a good comment saying that PM plus EQ equals project leader.
I love that.
That's just really nice little equation. Mark, would you care to go on, Mike, and share a little bit there?
Sure, why not? No, you were talking about how you lead, and the thing I always tried to instill in my team was to lead with empathy, rather than say emotional intelligence. I would take a particular piece of it and say, absolutely the self-awareness, and we would work through those things as well. But really, it's being able to walk into a meeting and understand what's around the table, who's going to be your ally, who is going to be your disruptor, who is going to be all these things. As a leader, PM leader, as opposed to someone that's scope, schedule, and resource all the time, I'm looking at who's bringing value. Yeah. I'm looking at what does you talk about MBTI and strength finders and things like that. We use a lot of those things with bringing my teams together and go, let's go through those processes and see who's what, and see how we work best together, and see who likes doing what each person likes to do, and feels not just competent in something, but confident in something. A little bit of this, a little bit of
that. That's great, Mark. Thanks. What about, Deanna, back to EQ and managing and leading teams? I think we've kind of hinted around that this really is about fostering, trust, and can improve collaboration, and the whole vibe of the team kind of increase. How, because we're in an increasingly online world, like this
Right.
call is a great example, but like my day job at Pinax, we are all just globally distributed, working in our home offices, for example. Like, how do you manage a team and apply these EQ skills when it's that much harder to really read and develop that relationship with people?
That's a great question. And we talk about this in the classroom all the time because this is here to stay, right? And, whether we're living in this hybrid world with our teams, we have teams that are global. And I would be really remiss if I did not mention the importance of cultural intelligence, and that's for a whole nother topic. But adding in that E component in this virtual space is very much possible. Take, for example, if you're running a meeting, and I always say to my students in particular that, especially when they're working on their capstones, when you're in this virtual space, Mark, you mentioned this as well, having that awareness, which is one of the components, right? That social awareness. So when we have that social awareness, we as human beings, we need connection with one another to function. Think about how many times do you put the camera on? How many times do you put the camera on? Or we think it's just okay because I'm multitasking or I'm doing something. And so when we're meeting with our teams, when we set up, there are always going to be exceptions, of course. But having that camera on adds this unique element of connection. I want to share just one quick story. Can I share just one story of COVID?
Please.
And so when we were teaching during COVID, of course, I had students all over the globe. And Pete probably remembers these days as well. And so, we had to foster these relationships. And so in my communications and stakeholder relations class, one of the key things that I started noting were the cameras were off. And of course, we had some students that were in some areas where bandwidth was an issue. So we understood all of that. But from an EQ perspective, I had asked. And so one day I decided I'm not going to put my camera on. I turned my camera off and I just started our class, and I'm a little bit animated. And so I just started going and lecture. And the whole message, Professor, your camera's off, Professor. And I just ignored them. So I went on for 15 minutes with the lecture. We took a pause, and then I took the camera on. And this led to the healthiest discussion in this classroom to say, what were you missing? I was giving you really strong words in this lecture of communication and how we communicate. But I wasn't emulating it because I turned my camera off and you couldn't see. What were you missing? So the conversation after really, really resonated with people. And I said, emotional intelligence is about that mutual respect of being able to connect with another person. It's about active listening. Active listening includes our body language.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't read that body language to be a more effective leader when I can't see. Now, mind you, during COVID, there were some things I didn't want to see, whether they were, anyway, that's another conversation in PJs and different things. But, those tiny little acts that we do online can make a huge difference. And how we foster those relationships is just as important online. So again, bringing back in that awareness, our self-awareness, that doesn't account just for the leader. It's our responsibility if we're on a team. That self-regulation. How am I managing things? Am I aware of I often will say to the students, what is your body language even saying? Are you squinting and you're looking down like this? I can tell right away.
Yeah.
So again, what is our body language telling? having that social awareness, making sure that we are paying attention, that active listening with intention. And then, of course, that creates that relationship management as well, and that relationship with others. Does that answer your question? I kind of went off on a tangent there.
I really like the story, but yeah.
It really did work. And it's interesting. I actually have an alumni that was in that class. She's coming back as a guest speaker in March. And we were reminiscing over that time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I remember, we all remember COVID, and actually there's a former colleague of mine who's on the call right now. I'm not going to call him out, but if he wants to jump in, feel free. But when everything shifted, right, we went from all office to this kind of experience, and that was a very obviously difficult. Obviously, in the context of everything going on, it was difficult. But just in trying to maintain relationships and keep projects moving, that was a whole massive learning curve. So really, the emotion, the EQ part that I guess I'm slowly working towards here is the understanding that everybody also had this context of just life crashing in different ways around them at the same time. So being aware of that as a leader, not necessarily just when there's a global pandemic, but there can be anything going on in anybody's life at any time, and being aware, or being able to have a good enough relationship that they can raise that to you and let you know so you can accommodate.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about conflict?
Mm.
You have that one stakeholder just driving you nuts because they want, they can't decide what they want, and they keep changing scope, whatever, right? All the stuff that shouldn't happen in your project. How some kind of practical approaches for this kind of situation where you're dealing with maybe somebody who's just not playing ball, or keeps throwing that proverbial monkey wrench into the works? How do you manage that with an EQ lens?
Yeah. So if we were using the EQ lens, obviously we want to do lots of preparation ahead of time. We want to be well aware of the situation before we walk in. That is actually EQ, is assessing what's happening. Not running in. That is looking at our impulse control. Think about that. What is your impulse control like? If you were scaling it, what is it like? And when conflict rises, often you can start to see we are very quick to react. We don't want to get into the avoidance stage, but we're quick to react. So where is that impulse control? How can you, and again, it goes back to how many of you love being yelled at, how can you stay calm and composed? Your body language is going to speak volumes. The tone of your voice. It's all EQ. It's all self-awareness. It's all self-regulation. Mm-hmm. How do you deliver? So right? If we go back to the TKI method and we think about how am I going to solve this? What am I looking for? Win-win, win-loss? What am I looking for? If we can manage our emotions, we can stay in touch with what we need, and we can also listen to the other person a little bit more. We have more ability to focus when we regulate our emotions as well. And so being aware of that body language, and I'm going to always come back to this, that breath. And, another analogy that I've used, and, think about still that cat in the hat, but when we're holding even balloons, and that's all the stress balls that are flying in the air, and when we hold onto it too tight, it starts to lift us. So one of the key things that we can do for managing that stress and using our EQ is to find the ground. To actually, whether you're sitting, whether you're standing, to find the ground to help you calm yourself, to regulate, then you're able to think clearer, and you're able to then deal with the conflict a little bit better. And again, conflict is different in every single industry, And it's constant. We know that in project management. So I would say that the staying calm, the listening, preparing in advance, and having that awareness and knowing what your impulse control is like. If you know what triggers you, you can be prepared before you go into a difficult conversation. And we all should be looking at that. That's self-regulation. We should all be looking at that. I know there are trigger words people can use with me. And if I know that during a conflict, I can react differently because I've prepared myself in advance. And again, not always do we have that luxury of being notified that we can prepare ourselves, which is why we need to probably practice this that much more, that we can improve each time we have those kind of situations.
Well, and I think that's really the takeaway there is that you can prepare for those conversations, but you're right. There's situations where you don't get the notice and you're just thrown into whatever that might be, and you've got it. But the practice of the earlier life and situations and practicing really does inform how you're behaving in any particular moment.
Yeah.
Which really speaks to your yoga practice and that side of your life as well, right? Is having that calm mental space that you can kind of take with you no matter what you're facing.
Yeah. And Kevin, the other thing that's in this as well is that in all projects we talk about reflection, right? We talk about lessons learned. And as leaders, a strong leader that's leading with EQ actually takes that pause and reflects a little bit to know, what could I have done differently? Mm-hmm. What could I change in the future for the next time? And it's kind of that coaching yourself, but it is really important because the next human that we deal with is not going to be like the last human because we're all different. And I'm sure all the leaders that are on this call, we've all led so many different types of people. No one is the same.
Yeah.
And as we are still growing, the way that I would have dealt with people maybe or led people 20 years ago, 25 years ago, Kevin, would not be exactly how I would lead them today. Because I had these lessons learned along the way for me to grow as a leader.
Just going to pause there again and see if anyone else would like to chime in with a thought, question. There's been a lot of really interesting topics here, and I don't want to, again, hog the whole thing. I will, but Mark, you just unmuted. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to throw out there is, I'm thinking one stakeholder in particular that was always doing end around, was doing a lot of things. And I realized there was two things I had to do. One is I had to change the venue of where we conversed.
Yeah.
One was, and by doing so, I actually figured out the second one. So I figured out every time I went into his office, he had his desk aligned in the room so that he was always in control. No matter where I was in his office, he was in the position of control, and even a little bit higher than me, right? I mean, my chair was a little lower.
Power.
Yeah, he knew
one leg was a little shorter than the others.
Yeah. He knew how to do it. So I took him out for lunch, and we sat down and talked over lunch. I didn't talk about the project. I asked him about his childhood, and found out that he was, my biggest thing was he always had to have his way. Even if we prep for a meeting and we go into the meeting and he'd just take it over. And found out he grew up in another country, a very different culture than mine. Grew up very well-to-do, had servants, had, all these things. His father was very powerful politically, had all these things. That was what he grew up in. I understood where he was coming from. He was coming from points of power. Power to him was the ultimate. And I had to figure out a way to equalize the power. And that was really the key with him, was saying, you know what, this is what you're supposed to do. But every time you do something that I'm supposed to do, it limits me. It limits my power. I mean, so I basically called him on the power struggle and said, we got to get past the struggle. We've got to get to where we understand each other's perspectives. I know you're 3 levels above me administratively. You're an executive vice president. I'm just a little EPM, right? But when we go into a meeting, I am just as much a peer as I am anything else with you. And we have to act that way. And basically came back to him and said, here's going to be our operating agreement together. This is how we will work together moving forward. But it literally took getting out of his office and breaking bread and understanding what his cultural experience was, understanding where he was coming from, what his triggers were, to your point, Deanna. It's what was it? And I, at the same time, had to be conscious of my own, because I go right to fear. Right. And he was a big guy, you know, so already he's got the physical thing. He's very, you know, very strong in his words. So again, everything for him was power. He had power. I had fear. Not not a thing. So I had to figure out a way to get past my fear, bring his power down enough to where we could converse, and had a much better relationship because of that.
What a great example. I'm curious if anyone else has a kind of a similar maybe narrative or anecdote just in terms of how to have that conversation, because that can be, to your point, Mark, like if you're coming from a fear response in a lot of these kind of situations, that's Herculean, you know, in terms of effort to try and have that conversation in the first place. But I think you recognize that this needed to shift, and you had a great, you took a great swing and managed to work out. I've had certainly not the same kind of situation, but I like your point of changing the venue. I remember years ago, I figured something out, and I've used it in every job since. And I was just trying to get people to review a document. And they wouldn't do it. I go to Mark and say, can you do this? I'm busy. I go to Deanna, can you do this? Well, I'm kind of busy. Go to Pete, can you do? And it was just all of the thing. Could never get everybody to agree to do this thing until I got them pizza in a boardroom, right? And got them all together just to work through this, and we got it done in about 45 minutes. So sometimes it's just a matter of recognizing that other folks have a limit, and their focus here on their priorities, and that's not a bad thing. That's not wrong, but they are still kind of you're a client of theirs that they need to kind of sort that relationship out too. So sometimes it's just a matter of taking them, put them over here, and making that conversation happen in a different way.
I love that you said that, Kevin, because again, sometimes as project managers, my priority isn't necessarily somebody else's priority.
Yeah.
And I have to always remember that. And is it Twassen? Put in the chat here, you have to study each member so they can open up. And I have to always remind myself, I am not a psychologist, but if I talk to the person and I have that healthy conversation, I can actually start to break down walls that may help foster those relationships, which again goes back to your EQ relationships. And learning how to respond and respect one another. And you're always going to have those challenging, like Mark's situation, stakeholders. And, if we start looking at where do we grid them? And if they are that high priority individual, we need to take them out for lunch, and we need to talk and find that even ground. And it does take effort. You're so right. But often the effort is well worth it. But again, if we were going back to that stakeholder management or that partnership management piece, am I creating the relationship with the right people and using my time wisely? And that again has that awareness piece as well.
Mark, I want to ask, in terms of, Deanna's talk about breathing. What was your breathing like before you had lunch that day? Just curious.
Again, I was in total state of fear. You and I have talked about this, Kevin, a little bit, and I wrote about it in my chapter in the book. And I come from a point of CPTSD, and I am all about fight or flight. And this guy was scary to me, not just physically, but power, power and his control over my project. Right. That was where I finally had to say, you know what? This is my project. Yes, he's the sponsor. Yes, he's controlling the purse strings, and in theory, he's the accountable party.
Yeah.
But as a project leader, I share that and had to find what it was that was going to be stronger than my fear. And for me, my integrity is my strength. It is my superpower against my fear. Yeah. And so I went in to first the conversations with him in his office. I realized that wasn't working out. But when I had that lunch with him, I went in there with the idea that I was coming at him with my authentic self. I was bringing him who I was, my truth for him, not to sound all psychology and stuff, but I was bringing him my truth, which was, this, and I got him to give me his.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. And, I always say, Danny, we're talking about, how much energy you put into it. I had to have a long-term relationship with this guy, right? And not just this one project, right? He was one of my key stakeholders. He was one of the 5 division heads, and I was going to have a lot of projects in his portfolio that we had to manage. So, it literally came to the point of me having to talk to my boss and saying, I'm about to go have this conversation with so-and-so. Do you trust me? Do you have my back to go have this crucial conversation? Mm-hmm. Right. You were talking about the prep earlier, Deanna, right? That, the crucial, I'm sure you've done the crucial conversation training as well. I had to be ready for everything he was going to come back to me with as well. That was the other piece of that, is like my integrity. And okay, he's going to beat me up because I came in late to his project. Wasn't my fault. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean, I literally showed up day one of the job, and they already had 3 vendors picked out, and they said, go run the vendor management with these 3 vendors and pick the right one. Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, just have to get over that fear. And for me, like I said, it's that integrity piece.
Well, thanks for sharing that too, Mark. Deanna, we've got about 5 minutes left. I have one more question for you. Then, of course, I want to open it up. Anybody else has questions? This is your chance. Big chance. Type it in or get ready to ask. But practical techniques. We've talked a lot about, preparing and kind of building that skill set up over time. But let's say you're in a team and things can be chaotic and all that kind of stuff. How can you better approach as a PM, as a project leader, using EQ again as the lens to really help with team communication, decision making, relationship management, all that stuff? What would be a couple of key things you would recommend?
It's interesting. Mark referred to his superpower. And, sometimes it takes us a long time in our careers to really appreciate and understand what is my superpower. And so, key techniques and things that I would give anyone in regards to emotional intelligence, know that EQ is about growth. EQ changes, and you have to practice it. If we're leading teams, it has to start with self. And so practicing and being well aware within the entire context of emotional intelligence, where are my strengths? Where are my challenges? And where we have our challenges, how can we as leaders work on those? How can we practice in those uncomfortable conversations emotional intelligence? If we know that we have a impulse control that's on a lower scale, how can I practice, even whether it's holding my hands together, sitting on my hands, taking that breath and not reacting? The more that we do this, the more that we grow as leaders. And there's always room for growth because our projects are alive and they're constant, and our people change all the time, just as much as we do. So I think key things is remind yourself that you need to give your time to yourself to grow as a leader. When we're constantly doing and giving as project managers, we forget that we need the oxygen. And I know that I get in the same situation and I have to do my self check-in and go, I actually haven't given it to myself in a long time. Taking the pause, the breath is found between the calm and the chaos. I think that's my tip.
That is a wonderful way to phrase it and a great way to wrap it up, I think, here today, Deanna. So I want to say thank you to you again for taking the time.
Thank you.
You're a busy person, and everyone else for joining the call. It's been really lovely chatting with you all.